Welcome to Founders Field Notes, the podcast where you can learn from founders how to become a founder. I'm Jason Klug, CEO and founder of Klugonics Group and serial entrepreneur. This week's episode, we have the founder of Altra Running, Jeremy Howlett. First time we've interviewed a shoe company, which is pretty neat because the development of shoes is a difficult process. It's hard to make a shoe fit on people's feet well, but Jeremy figured it out. Jeremy and his co-founders figured out the wider toe box with the zero drop design that helps runners' feet do what they need to do naturally to be comfortable for sustained running performance. They also have gender-specific designs to help adapt depending on what someone's foot is like in the shoe. So have a listen to Jeremy talk about his co-founders, Golden and Brian, work through the process of developing the perfect running shoe, years and years of prototyping, testing, validating, and what he learned along the way. My wife this morning, my wife's a marathon runner.
Okay.
So she's done Boston 3 times. She's working to do it again. We just had our first baby last year. He's now
Congrats.
9 months old.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So she's just starting to get back into, like today she's doing an 8-mile run, training run, so she's like getting back up and starting to build back her mileage, And she was saying that ultra running is she loved what you all did, bringing on and sponsoring pre and post baby moms on your team versus like Nike and them just drop them.
Yeah. And
that was something amazing to hear.
Yeah.
Right?
So years ago, we were in conversations with Carrie Goucher and it fizzled
That's
while
who
I was
mentioned.
there. And then the conversation came back, right? And eventually Kara left and came over to Altra and is kind of Altra's flagship spot, like flagship athlete, right?
Yeah.
And so with that relationship and even going years back, right? Like the ethos of Altra was kind of a 3-pronged approach, right? Like we had 3 pillars that we stood on.
Mm-hmm.
One was zero drop.
Mm-hmm.
Second was foot shaped, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a foot shaped toe box, like not the tapered toe box, right?
Absolutely.
And we can get into that. But the third one was we don't want to just shrink it and pink it, right? Like a lot of shoe companies take a men's shoe, they use the same last, and then they just put some female colors on it. So we rebuilt the female last from the ground up, specifically around a female foot, because there's some unique differences with a female foot. Obviously, men and women are different, right?
Yep.
Like, and so with that as like our original ethos, like that carries us in very well to catering to female athletes, and we've always wanted to cater to that female athlete specifically, right? Like they're not just an athlete, right? They're a wife, they're a mother, they're this, that, whatever, right? Like, and women come back after pregnancy a lot faster than they did when they went in. There is truth to baby doping.
That's
like
what I keep telling Kels. I'm like, Kels, next time you're running Boston, I'm going to be on the sidelines with our baby boy and think about the motivation you're going to get versus just me just waving at you. It's going to change your mentality even in the race, I think.
Well, and you also think physiologically as well, right? Like a woman that goes through childbirth went through major labor pains and her pain threshold has increased, right?
Like
so
24 hours of it.
So she can endure a lot more pain.
Yep.
And
that's something else
too. So you go throw that into a 26-mile race or a 13-mile race or whatever, right?
Yep.
Like she's going to be able to push a little deeper.
This is nothing,
run
right?
hard, right? Like there is, like, I don't know if there's probably reports and science done on this, but like there's a true conversation around baby doping, right?
That's a great point. It'll be interesting because she's going to do St. George, and if St. George, if she's not feeling ready for it, she'll just do the half as a training run, and then she'll do CIM, which is where her fastest race is so far. And, she's hoping to qualify again for 2025.
Nice.
Yeah. So she just loves that stuff, Also, Ed, our engineer, is a big ultra running shoe wearer.
Awesome.
He burned through, he's had the same pair of ultras for 6 years, 7 years? there's holes in them and stuff, but he still loves them. You know?
I think it's time for a new pair. But
no, he loves them. So great.
He's bringing down the lifetime value of the brand. Like,
that's
customer
fair enough.
lifetime value.
Enough. Well, he's a pretty frugal guy, so
No, that's awesome. That's great. Well, and our original shoe, the Instinct, that was our first and foremost, right? Like we kind of built that thing. It was a road shoe, but we had guys take it and gals take it on the trail and do all kinds of stuff, right? Like
he's a trail runner,
and
so yeah.
We were shocked to get reports that people were putting 1,000 to 1,200 to 1,500 miles,
incredible
running miles on a pair of shoes, when the average running shoe really is kind of shot after 300 to 500 miles, right? Like, and we were getting 4x that on people, and so it was like, well, maybe we made them too good, because as a brand, that's great, right? Like, get longevity out of your product. It creates loyalty. It creates brand following, but it also hurts repeat purchase.
Fair enough. Yeah. So do you think the longevity is the body of the shoe, or is it the foam durability and how it handles the compression and breakdown?
I think it's some of that, but I also think it's just when you wear a shoe properly, when you run properly, it's going to last longer.
Yeah, strike in the middle of your foot.
And instead of just putting a lot of impact into one area like the heel, right? Like, if you can spread out that impact across the whole sole, that's gonna increase longevity of your shoe for sure. And there's a lot more like arch supports and other just shapes and elements to a shoe per se, right? Like, then there's more that can break down.
Definitely.
Which Altra now, right? Like, has kind of evolved to, there's different arch supports and different things, right? But it's still that zero drop and still kind of pushing you to, or allowing you to run with proper running technique and running form. And so you can,
When did you start it?
So we started, we kind of concocted the idea, and I said, let's do it on my cousin, who was my business partner, on his birthday in 2009.
Okay.
So
been around for a good bit.
I went down to visit him at his house, and I was in the area, and I was like, I need a new pair of shoes. So let me go talk to Golden, and we'll see what he can get me set up with, and might as well go wish him happy birthday as well. And stop by his house, and he's like, hey, you should check out what I'm working on.
And this is your cousin?
This is my cousin,
Co-founder.
Yeah.
He's the R&D background of it then?
Well, I don't know, whether we call it background or not, but it was rough R&D. It was basement toaster oven R&D,
I mean,
right?
that's how some of my favorite... I love when a client walks in and they bring exactly that, like a benchtop prototype. You know what I mean? Like, this is what I've been tweaking, and here's my 6th version of it. And, like, those are my favorite projects to dive into, because they've answered a lot of the questions and the theory behind it, or whatever it is going to be, or the user experience, or whatever they've solved or focused on. Then they already have answered that question, and then we just have to figure out the rest around it.
Yeah, his R&D experience goes back to his dad, right? Like, his dad, Hawk, who's this, like, legend in Utah running, owns a running store in Orem, Utah, and
is that Golden? Is that
so Hawk is his dad, right?
Yeah.
So Hawk's my uncle, and so that's Golden's dad, right? So
okay, Golden is your cousin.
Yep.
Okay.
And so going back to Hawk, right? Like, in the early 80s, he blew out both of his knees at playing football. He was a highly touted baseball athlete in the late 70s, early 80s, and was now told that he would never play sports again. And as an athlete, that's a hard thing to hear, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like, what?
Yeah.
Well, he gets a postcard in the mail. It says, "Real men run marathons," and so even with both knees blown out, he's like, I can run a marathon. I'm a real man. I can do this.
All right.
And started getting into running, but found that the only way that he could run without, like, knee pain was to run, like, perfect form.
Yeah.
So he studied biomechanics and started studying running form and all of this, and eventually became a Saucony athlete and won the 1984 St. George Marathon.
Okay.
But if you look at his shoes, like, his early R&D was taking a drill or taking a razor blade to cut off parts of the shoe, drill holes in the midsole, make it so he could land better, make the shoe lighter, just all kinds of crazy updates and tweaks to the shoe. And so this is what Golden grew up knowing, right? Like, okay, if you want to take the outsole off of a shoe, you got to heat up the glue and then you can peel the outsole off. Well, I've got a toaster oven that makes my Totino's pizza rolls down in my bedroom. So let me use that. So he puts a shoe in, melts the outsole, peels it off, cuts off all of the midsole, and then takes some flat Spenco foam, double layers it, glues that on, cuts it to shape, glues it on as the midsole, glues the rubber outsole for traction back on. Yeah. And then takes that out now as his trail shoe. Okay. And that was his first ever zero drop shoe.
Right. And zero drop meaning this doesn't taper or angle, so there's a thicker heel.
Correct. Same height off the ground, heel to forefoot, right? Traditional running shoe is twice as high in the heel as it is in the forefoot. Yeah. Since Altra started, that heel height has come down quite a bit across the industry. Industry standard used to be 12 to 14 millimeters. Now it's more like 6 to 8 millimeters.
Yeah, then you see like the Zoom flies and stuff like that, right? Where they're like, massive amounts of foam is crazy to me. But I guess it just depends on, and it's also, there's a preference aspect to it, right? Like in your running style and what's comfortable and
to some degree, but also it's just years of marketing, right? Like you look at some of these big brands, like where have they made most of their money in running shoes and in footwear? Nike Airs, right? Like air pockets in the heel, right?
Yeah, now the carbon plates.
Some type of gel or whatever, right? Like it's all, we're going to add this new cushioning element to the heel. And now you see a lot more brands going with like a Biomogo, right? With just Brooks, right? Like, and it's all about the foam and the type of foam that they're using and less about the cushiony like gels or airs or whatever in the heels. And those are kind of going away out of the running scene. They were big in the 80s and 90s, but we're starting to see them taper away, right?
Yeah.
So
everybody's trying to do the carbon plate in a different way.
Yeah.
Right? Like because when the last few races I've seen, it's like when the flies came out, you see all the pink shoes, right? And then the next year, the next version, they have more of them in lime green and orange, and you start seeing like all of every runner's, like the majority of runners are wearing them.
Oh, color seasonality is that's part of the science of footwear, right?
But it's just so interesting because then Kipchoge does the 2-hour marathon and his with the springs on the toe box, or like under, and then it's like, so it's crazy to think about where the shoe industry is going when it comes to running. Are we going to start seeing like these spring-loaded freaking, like stilts or something down the road? Or are they going to get more simple and go with this where you're relying more on your foot shape and strength as it naturally works?
Well, I think you're always going to, like, every shoe company is going to be looking at what's the technology that we can put into the shoe, right? Like, because as you look at footwear, there's a number of key elements that you're looking at, right? Like one is cushion, right? Like I want cushion, I want comfort, right? Like that's where you see like the Hokas of the world, right? They came after this max cushion element, which Altra was out there in the forefront of it as well. Even though we got bundled into this like minimalist shoe, we've had max cushion since early on. But also then you look at rebound, right? Like, because rebound is a big thing when you think about running, right? Because if my shoe can help me rebound faster, then that's going to increase my speed, right? Which is what you're talking about with Kipchoge and some of these things, right? Like that's why you put a carbon plate in a shoe because carbon has high rebound, right? And so, okay, what's the next technology that's going to help me rebound? Springs might be a little on the far reaching end. Yeah, right?
Or I think there's the rules with like what you can actually race into, right? There'll be some limits there.
Yeah.
But
it's like you go, like there's certain shoes that are banned from the NBA, right? Like in basketball, you can't wear certain types of shoes because they give you a very specified advantage. running, you see the same thing, right? Like at least in the world marathons, right? Like Boston, Chicago, London, right? Like you're going to have, and then definitely the Olympics, right? Like there's going to be specifications that are like, you can't do this with your shoe. But then the other thing is weight, right? Like, and if you start, and that's why carbon is so popular because it's high rebound, but it's super lightweight.
Totally.
And so if you start looking at spring-loaded systems and all of this, how do you keep the weight down to not offset the benefit of the rebound, right? Like, because I've got to balance those elements between high rebound of my shoe versus, okay, now instead of a 6-ounce shoe or a 4-ounce shoe, I'm wearing a 13-ounce shoe for a marathon, right? Like,
and that's a lot.
Over the course of 26.2, that's a lot of weight, extra weight that you're carrying, right?
Yeah.
So, and for the average runner, that's not that big of a deal because heck, we can all probably lose 6 ounces off of our bellies, right? But when you're talking about the world elites, that's a big deal, right?
Right.
So,
yeah, those are like those little fine tuning things they're dealing with.
Yep.
So back to you working with Golden, your cousin, and with his toaster oven. He historically had some experience watching his dad modify shoes.
Yeah.
So, but at the time, obviously, I'm sure that the technology in the shoe market is different. Where was your knowledge at with running shoes when you came into this scenario?
So my knowledge of running shoes at the time was I put them on my feet and I go out for a little jog, right?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
So it was extremely limited, right? Like whether it was a Asics, a Brooks, a Saucony, a Mizuno, like I don't know.
Yeah.
Golden and Hawk just tell me what to wear and watch me run and say, okay, this one looks right enough. Like, go use this shoe. So that's what I'm hoping for at this point, right? Like, give me an assessment. I've had these shoes for a number of years now, and I've got to get back into shape. I got to get back into running steadily, and I need something. Like, right now, the shoes I'm wearing are giving me knee pain, and it's got to be the shoes. And my cousin's like, well, have you tried running on trails? Yes, I'm smart enough to know that I can go run on softer surfaces and it should be better, but it's not. And he's like, well, let me show you what I've been working on, right? So on his birthday in 2009, we're sitting there at his house and he's like, hey, like, this is what I've concocted. Here's kind of the biomechanics. Here's why we do it this way. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. Kind of cool. Like, where do I buy a pair? He's like, well, let's see what they look like on you first. Like, let's try them out. I'm like, what do you mean? It's like, let's go for a run. I said, I don't have any running clothes. I don't have any, like, I don't have these shoes. He's like, here, you wear my shoes. I will go grab you some running clothes. Like, let's go for a run. So we go out on like a 3-mile run together. Yeah. I'm wearing his hacked up, zeroed out shoes. And we're running and he's like, how's it feeling? How are your knees? I'm like, oh yeah, no, I don't feel it. Like, I don't have any issues with my knees, right? Like, he's like, hey, let me run behind you for a little bit and watch your form. And so he's watching. He's like, yeah, you're looking pretty good. And then we get to halfway where we're going to turn around and he's like, okay, now switch me shoes. It's like, heck no, dude, I'm not taking these off my feet. Like,
yeah, you're liking them.
Like, I actually feel good running, right? Yeah. Like I feel like I'm more fluid. Like, I don't have knee pain. Like, I'm not feeling anything in my lower back. Like, I want, like, this feels good. And he's like, no, well, let's at least compare, right?
Sure.
He's wearing a traditional pair of running shoes. So we switch shoes and then we start running. And he's like, okay, now how's that feel? And I'm like, dude, my knees are clicking. And he's like, yeah, I can see your form is all jacked up now. And like, we hadn't gone through any form technique training or anything, right? Like, it was just the fact that I now had a shoe that wasn't impeding my strike zone, right? Like, because I don't have this extra 12 millimeters catching me early as my foot stride comes through, right?
So you hit on your heel because there's more material there, right?
Yeah. And so
it makes total sense.
And so now I'm sold. I'm like, okay, like, where do I get a pair? Like, who makes these shoes? He's like, well, it's kind of an underground thing. People that come in and ask for them at the running store, we give them a regular pair of shoes and then we send them down to this cobbler here in Orem, this shoe cobbler. And then he takes a bandsaw and he cuts them up and zeroes them out for them. I'm like, so you're telling me I got to buy $100 pair of shoes and then I got to go spend another $20 to $40 to have some cobbler modify them for me?
Yeah. It's not quite a science there either with the... Yeah.
the science was so, like with the cobbler was like, he's
They're
registered
legit?
with Ortho, like he was legit, right? Like
All
it was
right.
like him and Golden worked together to just dial in. And I'm
so
like, okay.
he was doing this pretty often.
I'm like, so how many people have you done this for? He's like, oh, it's done it for a couple hundred so far.
Wow. Okay.
I was like, really?
There's your demand.
I'm like, really? Like there's,
that's at
he's
one
like,
store.
yeah, and we don't advertise. This is one store in Little Orem, Utah, right? Like it's like we don't advertise it. People just come in because their friend had shin splints or whatever and came in and got these modified, and then they told their friend, and their friend came in and they got them. It was like, well, what's the response? He's like, it's super positive.
Wow.
And so now I'm like, okay, I'm sold as a user. Now there's some market interest, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now explain to me like the science behind it. And he's majored in exercise science and physiology. He's done a lot of research into biomechanics and running form and Kenyans and all of this stuff, right? Like,
yeah.
And so he explains all the science, and I'm like, okay, like now it's backed by science. Like, why is nobody doing this? Why is there not a shoe company out there that's making a zero drop shoe? And he's like, I don't know. The only thing I can tell you is it's 30 years of marketing, right? Like they don't want to flip the script, right? They don't want to go against what they've been doing because like we talked about, right? Like they're hinging their businesses on gel in the heel, air in the heel, extra foam, right? Like extra like it's all about heel technology. If you look at shoes through the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, right? Like that's where their marketing dollars were going. What are you going to do about it? Is my question to him, right? He's like, well, as people come into the store, we'll modify these shoes. I said, well, like, are you going to run with this? Like, there's enough, sounds like there's a market, there's a potential here. Yeah. There's an opportunity. Like, what do you think? He's like, well, I don't know. I don't know that I'm kind of happy with the running store. Like, it's going to be mine someday, right? Like, said, well, let's start a shoe company. Yeah. This is all the same day, right? Like, and I'm just brazen enough to throw it out there. And he's like, well, we don't know anything about manufacturing running shoes. And I said, I don't care. We'll figure it out. Like, we will figure this out. And he's like, fine, dude, whatever. You find a way to help to get us shoes manufactured, and then I'll come and I'll help you. I said, okay, deal. I'll figure it out. Yeah. And so neither one of us had any manufacturing experience. We had no connections in the industry, right? Like Golden and then our third partner that we brought in, Brian, both of them have kind of consulted lightly just as running store managers, right? Like on like other shoe, right? Like, hey, you guys should do this, you should do that. But they also pitched this idea previously to other brands at Outdoor Retailer, and they basically got laughed out of their booths. Sure. Like, no, nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to buy that. There's no market for it, right? So apparently none of the big guys were coming in this space. How are we going to do this? So I jumped on LinkedIn, and at the time I was running a social media marketing consulting company.
Okay, so you have marketing background.
Yeah, this is in the early, and I was also working as a financial advisor. So I was running two jobs at the same time, right? I was a registered investment advisor, and I was trying to learn more marketing so that I could market my business, but then I kept running into regulation issues, and I was like, this isn't super fun. So I started a social media marketing agency back in the early days of Facebook, right? Like Twitter. LinkedIn was just kind of new, right? But so I jumped on LinkedIn, and I reached out to a couple of the groups that I was in. And I was like, hey, like I'm looking at manufacturing a running shoe. Kind of left it super vague, right? Does anybody have any expertise or any context in that? And one guy reached out to me. He's like, hey, like I've got this agency up in Portland that they take shoe concepts and they flush them out, right? Yeah. Kind of what you guys do here at Klug, right? Yeah. But these guys were specific in footwear. Cool. One of them was a former VP of Adidas. One was the head last maker of Nike. Another one was
Portland's like a hotspot for
lead
shoe.
CAD designer for Adidas and for Columbia, right? Like, and so these guys they got chops, right? Oh yeah. So their bird dog, their sales guy is the one that reached out to me, and he's like, hey, I'm actually going to be in Utah in a couple weeks at Outdoor Retailer. So we set up a meeting in the lobby of the Marriott Hotel there, right across from the Salt Palace, and so Golden shows up with this bag full of hacked up shoes.
Yeah.
And we're sitting there with Jared and the liaison there for their company and showing him our idea. And he's like, okay, like this is legit. Like this is really interesting. You guys have a story too. Like you're not just a product. And like, let me talk to the team, kind of feel them out, see where their interest level is. So we're kind of sitting on pins and needles. Like, okay, is this thing going to go? Like what's going to happen? We've kind of just put our eggs in this basket, right? Because we hadn't had any other contacts. There was nobody else that reached out. This was the one. And I was like, okay, well, if this fizzles, like, okay, this was a fun dream and whatever, right? Like, but we were still like, okay, like let's draft up. What does this look like? What is the opportunity? Like, and at the same time, like we're redefining the process at Runner's Corner, the running store in Orem there, and trying to, okay, like, we're going to market this a little bit more. Like we're going to throw a couple of these up on the wall. We're going to send out a survey with everybody. If they bring their survey back, we'll have Runner's Corner give them like a $5 or $10 gift certificate.
You're putting the modified ones on the wall and selling them? Okay.
Yeah.
So you're selling...
So we're not selling modified shoes. We just kept kind of a size run in stock that people could try. And then we would sell them that shoe. And then by their own fruition, they could go and get it modified.
Because
right?
you can technically... I'm sure the brands wouldn't like that,
We were not selling modified shoes, right? Like we were kind of marketing this idea, but we were not in the game of selling it. We let people make their own choice.
Yeah, Nike would not have liked that.
No. So
that's cool. Yeah, that's a great way to like you got validation with your target customers happening at the same time as, you know, I'm sure you're getting a good bit of input from people testing product as you're developing this. It's not like you're developing a prototype and you have no one giving you feedback. You're able to get feedback from your direct people using it. You're using it. You know, the running store people are using it. So you have pretty good, like, you know, resources wise to build something good.
Yeah, and we had hundreds, if not 1,000 plus surveys come back. Right, like,
that's awesome.
And like 90+% of those surveys were all positive, right? Like it was either I had shin splints and now I run and I don't have them, knee pain, back pain, like physical ailments. And obviously like we don't claim anything because we haven't done the double blind tests and stuff and all of that, right? Like Altra's not a surefire solution to all of this, but just because of the positive feedback that we were seeing, it was like, okay, like that's validating this whole idea, right? So while we're waiting for the group up in Portland, we're out just trying to figure out, okay, how viable is this solution? We get a call back from them that like, hey, we're really interested. Can you guys make a trip up to Portland? So in September, so from July now to September, now we're headed up to Portland. So we pack up Golden's car. We take this road trip up to Portland and
I've done that drive, like good 10-hour drive. I'm sure you came up with a lot of good discussions and value.
Lots of good conversation going there for sure. We show up at the president's house, Gary's house, and he walks us into his office. He's like, hey, check this out. And he's already started printing a last concept.
Cool.
So this is like 2009, right? So early 3D printing days.
Yeah, that's sweet.
So this is like my first look at a 3D printer. I was like, dude, this is awesome. This is way cool. So he's printing the last when we first get up there.
And what's the last?
And so the last is, so if you take a shoe, right? Like the last is the mold that goes inside the shoe. So if you think of like a shoe if you walked into a shoe cobbler, you would see a post with like a metal thing hanging off the top.
It's like the wooden thing or whatever.
But
it's spread out and everything.
It's wooden or it's like a hard plastic really now, right?
So, and your last, did you already have the toe box shape as part of that feature set?
So that was a key element that we wanted, right? Like zero drop wasn't good enough, right?
Sure.
Like the shoe actually had to be shaped like a healthy foot.
Yep.
And so we were drawing people's feet, tracing them, right? Like, okay, what does that look like? And really trying to dial it in. And so like Gary and his team had kind of taken some sketches and some ideas. And so they had started printing it. And so by by the first morning after we'd gotten up there, we had a last that was already printed and ready to like, okay, let's go. And then we go over to Vlad, the other guy's house, who was the last maker. He was the one that kind of designed the last, but he had a full-on like shoe manufacturing studio in his garage.
Cool.
Like all kinds of materials on shelves. He had sewing machines. He had rubber molders. Like he had everything.
Yeah,
like,
you found that. Like, you found the people for it.
Like we had an upper fit test before we left Portland. It was phenomenal.
Sweet.
It was awesome.
Sweet.
And then we were talking business with these guys, and they were in, right? Like we love this. We love the story. We want to do something, right? And
sure.
So from that point, we were off to the races, starting to like tweak and make adjustments and
figuring out the aesthetic and everything too.
And they had some contacts with China and with some factories over there. So we got in conversations there. And now we just hit the next roadblock, right? It's like, okay, like how are we going to pay for this?
Right.
And
good thing you have an investment background, right?
An investment background in the sense of stocks and mutual funds.
Well, but I'm sure with that, you're connected with the people that do angel investing and stuff. Is that how you're able to find did you find an angel investor?
We tried some of those avenues, but none of them came to fruition. Again, this is 2009, right? Yeah. So think about the landscape of the market.
True.
Like this is right in the midst of the recession, the 2008 recession, right?
People are way more
and
protect their guards up.
Yeah, so there was not a lot of capital flying around at this time. We endlessly talked to a lot of people and tried to find money wherever we could. Brian's dad put in some money, like Golden put in some money. Hawk didn't want to invest because he didn't want to just convolute between the store and the shoe brand, right? Like, which totally makes sense. But then we got connected to an angel. We put together a pitch and we sat in his living room with him and his wife and gave I would call it one of the worst pitches I've ever given. Yeah.
I mean, at that point you had a prototype and everything, right?
We had pictures, we had drawings, we kind of had, we had that one little upper, right? Like, but it was very limited.
Sure.
But we had a vision, we had a dream. We knew what we were going to do.
You had a survey results and data, and retail background. There's validation there. I feel like when you're walking into a pitch, those are the types of things they look for to make sure you have some of those boxes checked. So that's pretty valuable.
Yeah. So we had the story, we had the data, right? Like we had a lot going for us. But it was like, any startup, right, is still it's always a risk, right? Like throwing money at anything that has no sales is always a risk.
Were they a runner?
He was a runner. He was a triathlete. Okay. And had been into the running store several times, right? Like we were introduced by his triathlon coach, who was a mutual friend, right? And he actually was in the same church congregation as Brian, and Brian had been the scoutmaster for his boys.
Okay, so
so now there was a personal relationship, right?
Okay, that helps.
And so we're sitting there giving this pitch, right? And he turns to his wife and looks back at us, and he's like, "Okay, let us talk about it and think about it." And then, like the next few days, we're like, again, back to pins and needles, right? Like, okay, like what's going to happen? Like, are we going to get some funding? Are we going to be able to keep this thing moving forward? Or do we just shut up shop and walk away?
Yeah.
And we got a call back from him. He's like, "Hey, like we're in.
Cool.
You tell us what you need the money for, why you need it, how much you need. We'll write the checks." So it wasn't a flat investment. It was just
over time.
Here we'll invest the cash, right? And,
great.
And he wrote his first few checks before we even had an operating agreement in place.
Okay.
So
he believed in it.
He believed in it, trusted in us enough, right?
Yeah.
And so that was solid. We finally put operating agreement and stuff in place, and then we were off to the races, right? At the time, we were developing 3 shoes. We wanted to have a road shoe, a trail shoe, and then stupidly we made a minimalist shoe. The Vibram 5 fingers were selling really well. So we were like,
that makes sense.
we can make something like that without having to have the 5 toes, right? Like, And our shoe was very much like a Vibram 5 fingers, but without the 5 toes. And I think if it had released 2 years earlier, it would have done pretty well, right? But the pendulum started to swing back a little bit by the time we got it released, right? So we started this project in 2009. It was a couple months later that Christopher McDougall released his book, Born to Run. And that book release kind of launched this surgence of barefoot running, right? Like the barefoot running movement came in 2009, 2010. And by the time, like we launched the Instinct, our first shoe, in March of 2011.
Okay, so a couple years.
So really almost a couple years from the time that we
sense.
said, let's do this, to now we have an actual product, right? But then the Adam and Eve, which were our barefoot shoes. Yes, we had some fun with naming shoes, but those didn't release until, probably late that year. So probably not till like October of 11.
Okay.
And so now it's kind of in the realm of you're getting into wintertime, and then also the barefoot movement is petering out. People are starting to find out that, okay, a lot of people had TMTS syndrome, too much too soon.
Oh.
So they would go run barefoot, but they would do way more than they probably should have right out of the gate. And so there was a lot of foot injuries that were coming from that. And then this kind of became a groundswell on blogs and stuff at the time. And so a lot of people shut down from barefoot running.
That makes sense.
And kind of got away from the more minimalist shoes and wanted something with a little more cushion. And so we sold some, but at the end of the day, I think we had to end up clearing out a bunch at TJ Maxx and whatever.
Okay.
But back to the other 2 shoes, right? The Instinct and the Lone Peak, were like this is a redo of the original Lone Peak for the 10th anniversary of the Lone Peak.
Wow.
So Altra redid this.
So this is the trail running, right?
Yeah. So just some very slight modifications from the original. Different foam, little different rubber, but for the most part, it's pretty identical to that original shoe. The men's one's right up here.
What's this little Velcro thing?
We thought of stuff as like, we were all trail runners. We loved running on the trails. And so we thought of a lot of things as trail runners. And so when we made our trail shoe, we put a lot of certain things into it. So if you see this hook on the front, this little eyelet. So a lot of trail runners don't want to get sand and dust and debris into their shoes, so they wear a gaiter.
Oh, okay.
And so to attach a gaiter, you usually had to take an adhesive Velcro and put it on the back of your shoe so that gaiter would stick down on the back of your shoe. And so we were kind of going after the top selling gaiters at the time, like we were catering to them. So they have a hook up at the front to go on your shoelace. Well, we put an eyelet, so it doesn't need to pull at your shoelace. And then we put the Velcro pre-built in onto the back of the shoe. The other element of this shoe that was unique was we put what we call the trail rudder, which is this little extra rubber piece off the back end. So when you're descending down steep terrain, there's a little extra grab on the heel there.
Oh, that's smart.
To give you a little more extra traction to keep you from falling back on your butt.
That makes sense.
It did become a little problematic for some because if you run in the sand, it tends to catch sand and kick it up and hit the back of your legs. So there were some people that like to cut it off or whatever. But that was the thinking behind why we did. And then if you look at the way we designed the lugs, right? Like all your uphill traction lugs up in the front and your downhill traction lugs in the back. So just the way that those chevrons are placed allows you to have more traction going up and coming down. And then now on the side of the shoe,
certified shoe experts, like they're very well thought out, right?
They put Golden and Brian in a room and let them talk about shoes, and they'll come up with all kinds of ideas,
that's
right?
Cool.
And we wanted to incorporate a lot of that in, and we named all of our trail shoes off of mountains along the Wasatch Front, and so we had the Lone Peak, we had the Timpanogos, right, and then we had the Superior, and then we stretched it out a little further and went to the Uintas and released a King
Okay.
for King's Peak, right?
Yeah.
But on the side of the shoe, there's a mountain outline as well, and this one's a lot more simplified design than the original. But on the original, it was a direct silhouette of Lone Peak. So if you're looking at Lone Peak, you have that little notch on the top, and so that's what it was like on the original. So we tried to put as much fun into the shoe design as we possibly could, and have some good fun with it. So
yeah, that's great. I mean, those origin stories are always so fun to look back to and think about. And I've heard some interesting like origin stories, but that's like a good one. That's a very organic origin story.
And we did it organically, right? Like, we were out there dropping hints on blogs, reaching out to some of the more followed bloggers, right? Like, again, this is pre-Instagram days, right? So like this is the early days of influencers was bloggers, right?
Yeah.
Like,
so and then the gap between 2009 when you're a prototype, you're raising funds, all that type of stuff, and then getting to market, what challenges did you work through on the manufacturing level? You know, were you going out to China and Golden going to China working with these factories? Were you relying on the agency to do that? Like how did that go in the sampling and the refinement at the factory level?
Yeah, so we were relying primarily on the agency. So we were working with an agent, and they lined us up with the factories over there, and so it was primarily working through them. And so we would get prototypes, we'd get fit tests, and go through that. Golden was more in charge of the product side of things, right? So he'd be able to talk to that more. And I know, let's see, I'm trying to think if Golden made any trips to China before we launched. Like, I know he's been there a couple times since, but I don't believe we made any physical trips out to China before we got our first batch of shoes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Usually it's like you do a few runs, then you go and to build the relationship and keep the momentum going with the factory. Yeah. So that's great. Still working with the same factory? Have you kind of evolved, grown out of it?
No, they've switched factories a few times, right?
Yeah, so that happens.
As I haven't been involved with Altra now for 5 years since VF acquired them in 2018. So what VF Corp's done since then, I can't speak to where the manufacturing's gone from there, but obviously they've been in shoes with Vans and others and North Face, et cetera, right? So they've had strong relationships. And so whether they've moved to some of their own personal factories or what they've done, I'm not exactly sure. So
one of those things that I'll see commonly with founders and entrepreneurs is they're working through the development of a product. They don't share it, or they're afraid to get the word, or like to get input and put it in people's hands. I like that, you're surveying people, you're putting these, test shoes on people and getting feedback. What did you do from a marketing standpoint, like a pre-launch standpoint, before you launched with, the samples you're receiving? Are you putting those on runners and having them do marathons and stuff? What were you doing in that time frame when it came around the launch?
Our approach was twofold, right? Like in the running shoe business. So obviously Golden comes from a running store background, right? Like he started working in the store when he was 9 years old, right? Like, and Brian started working there when he was 15 or whatever, and in high school, and so both of them come from a specialty run space background. And then Brian also went on to manage a couple specialty outdoor shops and do some things there. And so our first and foremost was we were going to cater to specialty, right? Like the way we were going to set the trend, the way we were going to get in was we got to get into specialty running stores. And so we made a concerted effort to reach out to key stores. There was the owner of Playmakers up in Lansing, Michigan, was kind of on this running form kick and pushing some things there. And he was one of the most well-respected running store owners in the country. And we actually had him fly out to Utah, come spend some time with us, running our mocked up, hacked up shoes, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And give us feedback on some of the prototypes early on. And so we were trying to get this organic groundswell amongst run specialty, really. And then in 2010, we went out to the top run specialty like trade show conference, which is called the Running Event. It's held in Austin every winter, and we scraped up the funds to go there and put shoes on a lot of, like, we flew in probably 60 pair between men's and women's of the Instinct so that we could have samples there. And yeah, we just started passing out catalogs, telling everybody we're here. And we probably wrote and opened up 20 to 30 doors there.
Before you even had your inventory. That's fantastic.
Products. So, and then last minute we got a table at Outdoor Retailer here in Salt Lake, and we were literally in like a 4x6 corner tucked in there. And it's fun. Like, people that were at that first show, like our Japanese distributor came from that first Outdoor Retailer, and we've been crushing it in Japan ever since. Like,
that's cool.
And so that's been a great market for us. But we'll laugh with him, and right, like, he's like, I remember when you guys were in this little table stuck in the corner, right? We had one banner.
Yeah.
And so we really pushed hard through that channel. And then on the consumer side, we were just out trying to do what we could, right? Like reaching out to bloggers. We lined some people up that we could send some product to, right? And we had some people here locally that were kind of bought in on the idea. We'd talk about it a lot on Facebook and in Facebook groups, and like, not to say that there wasn't some fear, right? Like, I think there's always fear that the big boys are going to come and squelch you out regardless of what product you're making. And I wish that we could all just overcome that fear, right? Because I think it's so unfounded most of the time.
Yeah.
Like, I just started listening to No Rules, the kind of the Netflix culture story, right? And it intros with Netflix's story of Reed and sitting there in Blockbuster, right? Like here, we'll sell you this business and we'll just come run your e-com, right? Like, and Blockbuster had this chance to buy it for $50 million, right? And Reed and his team would have been happy, like, okay, let's take that and walk away. But that was the number they wanted, and Blockbuster laughed them out of the room and sent them away. But Blockbuster never was able to come after Netflix, right? Like, they could have tried to incorporate it themselves. They could have tried to copy it, but they don't. Nike never came after us. Saucony, Mizuno, Adidas, Asics, right? Like, these guys never copied us. And we're now 12 years since Altra launched and 14 years since we started this project. We gave up a lot because we were fearful of that, right? Like, early on, we felt like we needed more money and we needed to, and so even before we launched, we ended up selling out. And so we went through an acquisition early on, which is great. Okay, we went through an acquisition.
Wait, when did that happen?
So we got acquired literally 2 weeks before we launched our first shoe.
I didn't know that.
So Icon
fully acquired? You do like a PE deal?
Fully acquired. So
really?
Icon Health and Fitness acquired us.
That's crazy.
And so we were then brought in as employees, and we continued to run the brand.
Yeah.
Like, we built the brand, we ran it, we worked with their resources, right? Which was a struggle sometimes, right? Like trying to figure out how to move this battleship. So,
did you get to keep some chips on the table, or did they take all the chips?
They took all the chips.
Oh, wow.
So,
do you look back and regret that?
Absolutely.
Okay. That's
because a lot of it was founded on this fear, right? Like, we felt like we needed to get a big investment or partner with $1 billion company that could invest a lot of money into our growth so that we could grow fast. And absolutely, right? Like, did Altra grow faster because we partnered up there?
Oh, sure, yeah.
For sure, yeah. But if we'd have done it more organically, if we'd have done it more of a slow burn, like, what does that look like today? Like, that's a pretty rosy picture for the three of us, right?
Or get a few years under the belt and then do like a, more like a PE deal where you sell 60% to them and then let them take over while you still keep chips on or whatever.
Yep, absolutely.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't realize that. That's a big decision. But I could also see, 2.5 years or whatever of grinding before a revenue, and then you get an offer,
and the offer must have been good enough for you to take it, right? Where it's like, well, I mean, that's a pretty good ROI, right? That's a tough position to be in.
No, it's a tough position for sure, and it's like, and at that point, right? Even a salary sounds nice,
Yeah.
like, and
the completely de-risk for you, the families, all that type of stuff, right? I'm sure that had to be part of it.
Yeah. So between Brian and I, right, like we both had wives and kids, and Golden was still a bachelor at the time, so he could have floated it, but he was the one pushing probably harder to do the deal. But it secured us in this way that at least like, okay, now we know we have some financial backing to build this brand.
Yeah. In a big way.
I'm often asked, like, if you could go back and do it differently, would you? I don't know that I would do it differently because of all the things that I've learned because of it. But if I was to do it again, absolutely, I would do it differently.
Okay.
Like I would not put all my chips on the table. I would not have that fear, right? Like, and I think a lot of it at the time was just founded by this fear of like, okay, if we do this organically, if we do this slow burn, right? And just grow it gradually, then what happens, right? Like if New Balance says, you know what, Altra's starting to get a little bit of traction, we want to go copy that. Like we had some fear of that, right?
Yeah.
Here we are a dozen years later and it still hasn't happened.
Yeah.
Right. And so like they were definitely unfounded. And I think a lot of times those fears are unfounded. And we need to be careful to not let fear dictate what our future could be, right?
Yeah.
So we unfortunately let fear dictate what our future could be. And it hurts, right? Like it hurts to just think about it and talk about it sometimes.
Well, sometimes that ignorance though too, it's like like the very young founder, they don't have much experience and they don't have that fear, and that gives them such a huge advantage because they don't know what they don't know, and then part of what they don't know is the fear and the bad things that can happen. So they grind through it and they sometimes dodge it without even knowing they're dodging it, whatever it might be. So it's a good point. So then you've been basically, do you still work there? And you still employed by Altra?
No, so I haven't been involved with Altra since 2018.
So that's after another acquisition. So then they got sold to another company. Yep. And then you stepped down then.
Yeah. So VF acquired Altra from Icon in 2018. And that's when I completely left. So
yeah. So it's built it's a big brand to be proud of, and it's a cool origin story. No,
it's awesome. It was awesome. It was a lot of fun for those 9 years, right? Like being part of this, directly part of it, right? Like has been a blast. And it's the last few years watching the brand has been a little tough. Like the leadership, the president of the brand that they had just was not as keen on differentiation and those things. Came from a background of other running brands and just was kind of developing a Me Too. The story was kind of Me Too, and
starting
some of
to
those
follow
things
a lot of the. They following a lot of the other trends that you're talking about with like the foam and everything. Is that starting to happen?
No, thankfully they've still kind of kept to the foot shape and the zero drop.
Okay,
but, so that's been good. But they did just get a new president here within the last few months. So she comes over from Smart Wool and brings a good female perspective as well as just kind of some other outdoor experience and that. And so I think we'll see. Like I'm already seeing some of this story come back, right? Like some of these good things come back into play. And so I'm excited to see where she can take the brand and where the next evolution of the brand goes. Because I think she'll give a lot more finesse and care and appreciation to the brand ethos and what it is and what Altra should be, right? Instead of just another running shoe brand that is all about profit margins. So
yeah, that's an interesting story. I've never heard the fact that you sold before getting to market. It just blows my mind. That's pretty. That's crazy.
It is crazy. It's probably not the smartest decision, right? Like,
but at the time it might have been, right? Like that's the thing is, it's like where you were at 10 years ago versus now. the decisions that I would have made on various things 6, 7 years ago or 8 years ago, it's like compared to now, it's just so different. You know what I mean?
Oh,
so
for
if an
sure.
offer like that came to me, like Derive, my home goods company, like I think looking back and thinking, well, if I were to get an offer, like right after I launched my Kickstarter, would I have taken it for a couple $1,000,000? I probably would have taken it then.
Sure.
you know? Yeah. But right now I'd be like, screw you, that's offensive. But yeah, that's cool. So what, are you working on anything else now? What have you been doing since Altra?
So since Altra, I've been kind of consulting with some brands. I've worked for a couple of brands in the product space.
In shoes or other?
Not in shoes. I'd love to get back to shoes or outdoor, right? Like I'd love to be back in that space. But I've helped a SaaS startup called Cinch, which is a marketing automation software.
Yeah.
And I helped consult a little bit with them and helped get them to launch phase and work through that. I spent some time going back to school to finally get my bachelor's and get a master's degree. And then in 2020, I started a marketing automation agency. So we go in, consult with companies, and also execute and implement on marketing, email, SMS, a lot of those strategies. And we're experts in that field and experts in getting just elements and marketing pieces put into play and making sure that companies are telling the right story. Like I've built a brand, I've successfully launched it, I've helped other brands and helping just optimize the story. Like what is it really that makes your brand valuable, right? Like right now I'm working with a tea company that's based in Virginia that's kind of Indian born loose leaf tea, and we're just really trying to hone in their story. It's called Teenaroo, and they're super interesting and exciting because it's different. It's not just another like celestial teas or whatever on the shelf, right?
Yeah.
So having fun working with brands, and I love helping companies solve their problems and just find the pieces to just be connecting the dots, right? Like how do we get you from point A to point B, whether that's e-com or whether it's, okay, what do we need to do to get you into retail? What does that look like? What do we need to do to optimize your supply chain, et cetera, right? Like I've been involved in all of it. And sometimes I wonder if it's a detriment that I know enough about so much. But so it's, having started a company, right? Like you learn so many things because you're into everything. You have to be into everything, right? And even though Golden was primarily running on the product development side and Brian was primarily running on the sales side, like I knew enough about those areas, right? Like, but then I was the one doing everything else, right? Like operations, marketing, IT, right? Like that was all on me. And
well, you're still part of the conversations, and
absolutely,
and that's so valuable.
So
or you're sitting by the side of someone learning it, so inevitably you learn it too, pretty much, because you're watching them, go through failures and successes.
And I've sat at enough trade shows, and I've gone into enough retail, right? Like one of the coolest stories is right after we launched, right? Like right after the acquisition, we got our first shoes. They finally showed up. We put Brian's Thule box on the top of his Subaru. We crammed that thing full of boxes of shoes. And then him and I hit the road. And we drove out I-80 and started staying in cheapo, crappy motels and
just hitting running stores.
And we just hit running stores. We were talking with potential sales reps along the way, right? Like we spent time in Chicago with a sales rep. We spent time up in Michigan with a sales rep. And then we drove out to the Boston Marathon, and that was our first kind of foray into things.
Cool.
Like we had a little 10x10 booth at the Boston Marathon in 2011, and that was really our launch, right? Like that's where we were. And
I wonder if I think my wife did 20. Oh, no, she did she was there the year of the bombing.
Yeah, so 2013.
She heard the bombing. So I think she might have done 2011 as well.
I was there as well. That was another crazy story, right? But
I'll ask her about that. That's cool.
But even though and this is the crazy thing I look back at, right? Like we were so frugal and we were so responsible with money, right? Like even after we were acquired, while the executives of this $1 billion company were flying business class and they were staying in the suites, the Marriotts and whatever, right? Like Brian and I were price lining cheapo 1 to 2 star hotels along this dingy route on I-80.
Yeah, even though it was on their dime at the time.
And it was on their dime, right? Like, but we were so frugal and we were so we just wanted to be profitable from day one, right? Like we wanted to make this thing work. And when in reality, right, looking back, we could have stayed at least in a Residence Inn, right?
Yeah, that's funny.
Instead of the Travel Lodge in Michigan City, Indiana, getting woken up at 2 a.m. because some drug deal was going down.
That's crazy.
Parking lot.
It's a great, one of those great startup memories.
But then Brian submitted that mileage expense report. And that definitely went down in icon lore for sure. It's the longest miles expense report. So we drove all the way out to Boston, and then he dropped me off at the airport in New York on the way back, and I flew home from New York, and he continued his drive down the East Coast and into Texas, and then back up into Utah. And so he circumnavigated the whole U.S., right?
Yeah.
Like
hitting running stores,
working with sales reps, right?
Cool.
Like, and so that was a lot of miles.
That's a lot. Is it? So is the shoe industry then pretty rep based? Is it similar to like other outdoor products?
Yeah, definitely. In outdoor and run specialty, it's all rep based, right? Like most brands use independent reps, some use internal. But it's very rep heavy, right? So finding those right relationships of reps that had experience, that had chops, and that were willing to take us on, right? Like that was a big deal. And thankfully, we got some really good ones early on. We got lucky.
Yeah, because I've been I know like the apparel industry is something I learned recently. I interviewed For All, the two girls, their golf company. Have you heard of them?
Yeah.
And they were explaining to me how they have their set packages they sell to a retailer, a boutique retailer, where it comes with this many sizes, this many SKUs, and it's pre-packed up, like ready to go. Is the shoe industry similar where you have package 1, 2, and 3, and they're different sizes? Or do you have to custom tailor a purchase with the number of sizes of each SKU and so on and so forth?
We would typically do like minimums, right? So you would get certain breaks at certain minimums, right? Like if you ordered certain quantities. But really, we kind of left it up to the running store, right? Because especially with shoes, like feet are so different, right?
Yeah.
Like in different parts of the country are different, right?
There's
like
so many sizes.
And that's one big thing that a lot of people don't understand, right? Like jumping into a footwear company,
it's hard.
It's hard.
Out of any of the apparel and footwear, to me, it sounds so much more difficult than like making a bunch of baby toys and bags and stuff, right? So that's why I'm always like, yeah, that's tough.
See, I'd agree, except I feel like apparel's got to be easy. Like,
I mean, it still has the sizes, but also,
you're only
body shapes.
But you don't have to deal with tools. Like,
true, yeah, you can just you're just stamping stuff out pretty much, sewing it together, cut and sew. Yeah, that's fair.
So
the shoe size, the foot bases, and everything.
But shoes, like we had an outsole tool for the rubber, right? Like we had a midsole tool. Yep. Right, and then you've got the upper, and you've got the last, and you've got
shot rubbers, right? Or is that that's done in one pump? It's more like compression molding, right?
Yeah, this is a single molded. This is a full molded outsole, right? But you've got different tools for that, right? And then every tool you've got to have every full size up, right? And then you've got to have a new last for every half size. And so you think about a standard run of shoes. On the women's side, you're looking really 5 to 12, and you probably don't have an 11 and a half. And like we didn't come out with 12s until probably a year and a half into the business on a women's side, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you might do a 4.5. You might not do a 5.5. You might just go 5, 6, and then every half size up through 10, and then maybe an 11, and then maybe a 12.
That's a lot of tools. How many tools is that?
So,
that's like 12 tools or something, right?
Yeah, and then you've got on the men's side as well, right? Like from men's, you might go down as low as a 7.
Yeah.
Maybe you start at, like we started out of the gate at an 8, and I think we went 8, 9, 9.5, 10, 10.5, 11, 11.5, 12, 13. And then eventually we added a 14.
Mm-hmm. And that's 2 tools each.
And so you've got an outsole tool and a midsole
and the rubber tool.
And then you've got a last for each, right? Like, and so it's not, and then we were doing 3 styles of shoes to come out of the gate with, right?
Yeah.
And it's not cheap.
That's not cheap at all.
Yeah, it's an expensive product to start.
Well, then you're going against like giants too. That's the other thing. It's like in the shoe store, I mean, going against Nike and Adidas, like you're saying, it's like...
Well, their marketing budgets are
huge.
Their marketing budgets were more than what our total revenue for the year was.
And it's
right?
hard to, like a lot of loyalists too, right? Like there's a lot of loyalists to the brands and everything.
That's the thing about shoes, right? Like especially running shoes specifically is getting somebody to switch shoe brands or even shoe styles is really hard, right? Like your wife's a runner. She probably is running the same style of shoe.
She mixes it up.
Does she mix it up?
She trains in Brooks. She, the races she does use like the Zoom flies and, she'll get her racing shoes.
Yeah.
But she'll have, I've seen her try Adidas for training, Nikes. I saw her, she had a pair of Sauconys recently that she trained through. So she tries a different variety.
So I wouldn't say
different.
She's an anomaly, but
it's different.
A lot of the things we would get, right? Like the number one thing I would hear at a trade show, right, or at a running event, right, like go to an expo at a marathon, is somebody would come and they'd show me their shoes. They're like, I love these. You aren't going to change them, are you?
Mm-hmm.
Because they'll talk and then they'll all have a story to share, right? Like, oh, I loved the Brooks launch version 4 because it just fit my foot. It was so good. But then when they came out with the 5 and it just didn't feel the same. So I went to my running store and I bought every single pair of Brooks launch 4s that they had in my size. And I had like 7 in my closet, right? Like, and because people they fall in love with a certain style of shoe.
And they burn through them.
And then they just want that style, right? Like that's what my foot's used to. That's what I'm used to. That's what I want, right? Like, and so we would get that all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like, and it's hard to get people to switch brands. But once you get them to switch, right? Like, it's kind of like formula brands, right? Like there's a reason why you get the free bag of goodies from Enfamil in the hospital. Because if they can get you to get your baby using Enfamil, then you're not going to switch to Similac or to whatever else, right?
Same with dog food, right?
They got you hooked, right?
Yeah.
Same with dog food, whatever, right? Like, it's why Apple goes after college students so hard, right? Like, if I can get you using Apple products while you're in college, when you're most likely going to be committed to a device, you're never going to switch.
Yeah, makes sense.
And it's the same thing in running shoes. And so what does that do to your customer lifetime value? Skyrockets it, right? Like, and you think about it from a marketing standpoint, right? Like running shoes and apparel's kind of similar, but running shoes is like it's this beautiful mix. It's why brands spend so much to acquire a customer in the running space because I can sell you $130 pair of shoes, right? But I'm willing to spend $150, $200 to acquire you as a customer.
Yeah.
Because once I get you in as a customer, you're going to come back and you're going to buy 4 to 6 pairs of shoes from me every year.
Yeah, especially if you're doing like 50-mile weeks, you know, training. And Kelsey too, she alternates daily so the foam can rebound a little bit. So she's buying 2 pairs at a time.
You usually have 2 pair that you're
she cycles between them, and she gets her.
And then if you go do trails at all, then you've got a trail shoe, and then if you race, you've got your racing flat, right? Like, and
It's a lot. That's a good, lifetime value is big there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially with like a good price point item versus like, the bath mat company, Durai, like our goal is to make them profitable first purchase. So with acquiring the customer, free shipping, all that stuff. So it's like, $90 price point. If we weren't doing that, and lifetime value, our average order value is like $130, so usually they throw in like an accessory or whatever.
Right.
And then the other thing, and then when it comes to lifetime value, we're creeping like, $300 or so, which is great, but yeah, how many bath mats can you have? You know what I mean? Or how many dish pads? And usually it ends up becoming something they gift to people and stuff, and that's the value add. So yeah, running industry, hard industry to get into, hard to compete with, but it makes sense as it's a good industry to be in when it comes to customer loyalty and
no, it's
huge.
Once you're there, it's great, right? And like, and I look at a lot of these companies that like apparel companies want to do shoes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a value add, right? Like, but if you don't do shoes right, then okay.
Especially a performance athletic shoe, running shoe, weightlifting shoe, whatever, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's just so costly to get in, and there are ways to cut corners. Mm-hmm. Like you can go and you can take a last off the shelf in China, right? Like somebody's already developed a last, or it's just a standard last, right? Mm-hmm. And you can probably come and piggyback on somebody else's tools, right? That are to be retired or whatever. And and you can probably do stuff like that to really save some money, but you're not innovating.
Yeah, or you're not going to be a quality brand that keeps loyalty. You're just going to be someone looking for a cheap shoe and they'll buy it once and then maybe they'll upgrade to a nicer one. They realize they like running.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've personally, I'll run like, a couple times a week and I'll do like a couple miles. I'm not like a big runner, but I have used Brooks shoes in the past and they're pretty good, I think the thing I like about them is that they just focused on running, kind of like you guys have, right? Like they focused on that niche. And the ones that I've liked are they're glycerins because of I don't have knee pain anymore with them. But to your point, it wasn't the shoe that got rid of my knee pain. It was me working with a triathlon trainer and my fitness trainer and figuring out my hips positioning, my how far forward I'm leaning and my strike and all that stuff.
No,
and that changed it, not the shoe. So it'll be interesting because I want to try these and see how that affects it as well, because now that I figured out my running form.
For sure. Yeah. And at the end of the day, so much of it just comes down to form, right?
Sure.
And to how you run. The thing that I don't know that we necessarily expected, but kind of anticipated maybe a little bit, was the number one thing that people loved about our shoes wasn't the zero drop. It was the foot shape.
Yeah, makes sense.
And now looking back, right, like it's total sense, right? Like, and it wasn't an afterthought that we did it, right? Like it was very thought out. It was very, very on purpose, right? Like we were not going to come out with a tapered toe box, right? Like, because the problem is now you're pinching your toe in, right?
Totally.
Like, and your feet don't have the ability to display. It causes more fatigue. It can cause plantar fasciitis. It can cause some of these other issues, right? But by opening up that toe box, it allows that big toe to splay out more, gives your foot more room.
More stable.
And a lot more stable, a little more power coming off the toe, right? But just overall more comfort.
Yeah.
And so the slip-in feel is awesome. And the one thing that, as we look at Altra and kind of the consumer base, was, we catered to runners and we were a running shoe brand, but we captured a lot of off the couchers, right? Like people that just couldn't walk or very far because of their shoes or whatever, and could now start like I remember what was this? This is a 2011 Ragnar, I think, 2012, Wasatch back Ragnar. We had a couple of super fans, and they'd bring everybody they knew by our booth, right? Like they had this little tent at Ragnar, and Matt brings his parents by, and he's like, "Hey, you guys check these out. Like, I've fallen in love with these shoes. You guys should check them out." And they bought a pair. His mom and his dad had bought a pair from us, and then the next year we were at Ragnar, and they came at the finish line, and they're like, "We just ran it." They weren't runners the year before.
Wow.
And they're like,
cool.
"Yeah, we just did it. We were on our son's team. Like, we just ran it." And they started by just going out and walking, and it could be more comfortable walking. And they got back into shape, and they started running, and then they did
Doing
Ragnar
walk-runs,
together, right? Like,
yeah.
And it was stories like that was like, okay, like, well, this is all worth it, right? Like, I don't care how much money I make. I don't care what the story, like, this is why, right? Like, this is why we started Altra. This is why we did it. And this is why Altra exists.
That's great validation.
And it was awesome. And that was like we really wanted, we kind of had two major marketing approaches, right? Like one, we wanted to be the authority in all things running. And so we're not just going to talk about running shoes. We're like in our emails, in our social posts, in our ads, and like we started just before I left, we were trying to really put on like a national tour.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was trying to build that. I kept getting the kibosh from upper management with Icon, but I really wanted to do it, and we tested it out in like 5 cities, but we did this series called Run Talks.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can still find them on YouTube, but we partnered up with Runner's World. Mm-hmm. and then we would partner up with local running stores around the country, and we would bring in a Runner's World rider, editor, mm-hmm. and some local like science person or nutritionist or fitness or whatever, right? Like, and we would do these series called Run Talks, and it was really cool. And there was like, we were starting to gain some interest around it, but it was really around this concept of we wanted to be the authority in all things running, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we're going to talk about nutrition. We're going to talk about running plan. We're going to talk about apparel. We're going to talk about all these things that don't necessarily have to do with running shoes. Mm-hmm. Because we felt like if people were more educated about running and how to run better, they're going to run more, and they're going to need shoes to do it, right?
Yeah,
like,
they're going to remember who taught them that tip or trick that helped them not bonk on a run because they got the right nutrition or whatever, right?
Absolutely. So that was cool. Marketing approach number 1, right? And then our second marketing approach was we kind of took the Pepsi approach of don't drink water, right? Like Pepsi knew that they could never chip away at going directly at Coke, right? And so their CEO came in, he said, okay, like, if I can't get you to stop drinking Coke to drink Pepsi, but can I get you to stop drinking water and get you to drink Pepsi? Mm. And so it was the 90s or 2000s. I don't remember when they kind of pushed this, but I've read a few stories about it, right? But their idea was, okay, like, we're going to get you to not drink water, right? Mm. And so the concept of that kind of hit me, and it's like, okay, well, maybe I can't get runners necessarily to change their running shoes, but can I get non-runners? Can I get walkers? Can I get these individuals to change the shoes? Because they're not as loyal to shoes as hardcore runners are, right? Yeah. Like, if I can get just the average like weekender 5K-er, right? That it's not as crucial to them what shoe they are. Because it's going to be really, it's hard to crack the marathon circuit. Sure. We did it, but it's hard to crack it. Yeah. But if I can get you that's trying to do your first 5K or 10K to come and get a pair of Altras, great. There we go, right? Like, and so that was another foot, right? Like, so we went hard after that market, and we tried to approach that market. That's a really smart approach. So, plus, we just crushed it in the trail running, right? Like Altra and Hoka are probably now the 2 top trail running shoes in the market, right? Yeah. And we knew how to own that. That's our background, right? Like, you look right out our offices when we started in Orem, Utah, right? Like, we literally placed our offices at the old WordPerfect campus because I could be to a trailhead in 5 minutes running.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and I could access miles of trails. Right. Like we were purposefully placed there.
Yeah.
And because we love natural surfaces, right? Like, and so it was really easy for us to build the trail side of things and to put a lot into developing awesome trail shoes. And we did, and we crushed it, and we had a lot of fun doing it.
So what are some takeaways you'd give to other entrepreneurs and founders that are the big things that you learned that you always look back to and bring up consistently when you're consulting other businesses?
Yeah, story is so big, right? Like I think like anybody can produce a product, but it's the why, right? Like why are you doing this? What's the story behind it? What's the purpose? Like what makes you different? And even if your product is the exact same as somebody else's, there's something about it that you can make different, right? Like even if it's your origin story, don't make it up, right? Like but have some why behind it, right?
Yeah.
Like I love Simon Sinek's book, starts with why, right? Like his whole philosophy there is great. But finding that purpose and that passion behind it, because at the end of the day, if it's just a job, if it's just another Me Too product, when it's hard, is it going to wake you up in the morning? Are you going to want to go and push forward at it? Probably not. And are you going to be able to convince your customers all the time to do it, right? Like, that's going to be tough unless you're really behind it and really passionate about it. So
it helps internally and externally.
Absolutely. And then just building that as part of your core values in your company. And then everybody that you bring on board gets bought into that, right? Like, and they love it. Like it's been hard for me over the last few years to watch people leaving the brand by choice as employees, right? Just because they don't feel like the core values are there anymore, like they were when they started. Like when we hired some rock stars right out of college for way less than we probably should have got them for. And they crushed it and they had a lot of success. But now I'm seeing them leave to other brands and go do other things. And some is because they had differences of opinion with the prior president and he let them go, or they just didn't feel like the brand had the direction that it needed anymore. And that's hard, right? Like that's hard. Like to see those core values maybe disappear. And I'm hoping that with this new president, that the brand gets back to those core values and gets that resurgence and can really bring that internal loyalty back. But like there's still reps and tech reps and some of these people there that were there when I was there. And that's awesome to see. Yeah. And even though two of the founders are not with the company anymore, like Brian's still there and he's got a pulse on it and he's hopefully able to influence his thoughts and his feelings to keep the core ethos there. But
do you think that the reps, that are still around because they're working with Brian on the sales side of things? Do you think that's part of it?
Yeah, Brian's not as much involved on the sales side anymore. Okay. He's doing some more PR stuff and whatnot. But I do think that they know what the brand was and the product is still there and what the brand still can be, right? So I think that's worth sticking around, right?
That's good, yeah.
It's always hard when you start something and then you're not involved anymore. And like, I'd love to still be in touch with the brand, still involved in some aspect, right? Yeah. But
it's going now to a different owner and everything. I guess you can get friendly with the new president and see what you can do.
We'll see what happens. So.
Trickle in a little influence here and there. So,
but kind of back to advice, right? Like understanding why, having that story, right? Like you're gonna have hard days, right? Like days are going to be hard. Stuff's not going to seem like it's piecing together, and you just got to push through it, right? Like you got to be persistent. You got to figure it out, right? Like. And learn, right? Be open to learn, be humble, and go find the people that can help you solve the problems, right? Because we don't, as individuals, even if we have co-founders, we don't all know everything, right? Like we don't all understand everything. There's still a lot that we can learn. And don't let fear dictate your decisions, right? Yeah. Like we talked a lot about that, but just be full of hope and optimism and drive to what it can be.
Yep.
And then you'll eventually see, like, you'll see success. Like,
yeah, it does take persistence and patience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like my bank account may not show that Altra was a success, but I can assure you that, like, watching the brand and seeing where it is, like, I am grateful for what we've done.
It's a known brand for sure.
So
yeah,
it's been so much fun to be able to say, yeah, I started that, right?
Yeah,
like,
it's pretty sweet.
So
in a very tough space, it's pretty impressive where how known it is.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming.
Yeah, no, it was a pleasure. I appreciate it, Jason.
Yeah.
This has been a lot of fun.
Fun chat.
Absolutely.
There we go. Jeremy Howlett, Ultra Running. How a small little shoe brand out of Utah was able to compete and differentiate from the big players of Adidas and Nike with a unique and innovative shoe design that made it more comfortable for a user to wear as they ran for many, many miles in their shoes. So before we jump through the field notes, I wanted to mention Klugonics, my company. That's why we do this. That's the reason why this keeps going. We do full service product design, engineering, prototyping, manufacturing, sourcing, and management. We help entrepreneurs, founders build products from ground up all the way through manufacturing. With our offices here in the US and internationally, we're able to help a product go from napkin sketch to a customer's doorstep. Reach out to us on our website, klugonics.com. That's KLUGONYX.com. So the field notes from Jeremy, he's obviously a very seasoned entrepreneur. Not only with this project, but other things he has worked on. And I like when I get to interact with entrepreneurs that, they hear an idea and that triggers and helps them realize, like, oh, we could do this on our own, which is a big leap of faith. But without him getting triggered by Golden's, shoe designs that he was working on manually by hand, the Ultra shoes would not have started. So with his background in the marketing and sales, combined with that technical expertise, they were able to create something that was very unique and special. I do like the point that he made about not letting fear dictate what the future could be. I mean, being an entrepreneur, fear, you cannot let get the best of you. You have to push through it and avoid letting it get to you and making decisions or pushing forward or going as big as you can go. And that's what determines a good entrepreneur from a bad one. Like me, sometimes I'm a little bit too optimistic, but I will say that has definitely helped me and the people around me get through challenging times in building business. Looking forward to what it could be can a lot of times prevent you from getting hung up on what it shouldn't be or how it can fail. And if you do fail, if optimism is there to pick you back up, that failure end up just becoming a learning lesson versus, just pain, which will happen too. You can't avoid that, but that's okay. So to his point as well, anybody can produce a product, especially with tools like Alibaba and stuff. But I can tell you a lot of that stuff out there is just repeat, lack of innovation, or it's copying someone else, versus not everybody can create something innovative and unique and disrupt the market or, step outside of what's already on the market to create your own demand. So it's always good to ask what makes you different, what makes the product you're working on different, and make sure you're repeating that as you're going through the design and development process. And with that, it's always good to build a why into your core values that are sprinkled all throughout the development of your business and your product. And as you set up everything for that company and are setting those core values, be very intentional about that why. And then, of course, be open and humble to learn. I always personally like to surround myself with other entrepreneurs and ask them questions and, having conversations with entrepreneurs on this podcast, I've learned a lot. I think it's valuable to stay humble. And I've seen entrepreneurs that maybe have struggled throughout the years. And I think that's a big piece to what is preventing them from becoming successful. Definitely important to stay as humble as you can, because you might put up a barrier that prevents you from learning something extremely valuable that takes you on to the next step. So really appreciate that, especially coming from Jeremy, who has had quite a bit of experience founding, building, growing a business, and now helping a lot of other businesses today with doing exactly what he's done for ultra running. So thanks for listening. It's great to talk to a different type of product company with shoes. Very challenging space to get into, but Jeremy has proven that it's very possible to do. You just have to create something innovative and unique that stands out. So thanks for coming on, Jeremy, and we'll see you in the next couple weeks with our next episode. Follow us on social media platforms like LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, I guess Threads now too, if that's still a thing when this episode airs. Thanks for listening. See you next time.